Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he worked on the broken fence under the hot afternoon sun. His ranch on New Helena wasn't much to look at, and most days he wondered if he'd made a mistake coming to this dusty planet at the edge of known space. 15 years he'd been here, and 15 years of barely scraping by with his small herd and failing equipment. The land stretched out before him in waves, of red dirt and stubby grass that his animals could barely survive on, and some days he thought about giving up and heading back to Earth with nothing to show for all his work. But this was his land, and that meant something to a man who'd grown up with nothing. He hammered another nail into the fence post and moved down the line to check the next section. The sun was starting to drop toward the horizon when he heard a sound that didn't belong in the usual chorus of native creatures that lived in the scrubland around his property. It was a cry of pain, and it sounded intelligent and afraid. Jake grabbed his tools and headed toward the sound without thinking much about it. His property bordered the lands that belonged to the Kalari, and most human settlers knew to stay clear of those invisible boundaries. The Kalari were the native species of this planet, and they'd been here for thousands of years before humans showed up looking for new worlds to colonize. They kept to themselves mostly, and the treaty said both sides would respect each other's territories and not cause, trouble. He pushed through a grove of twisted silverwood trees and found her lying near a dried-up creek bed. She was Kalari, and her leg was caught in a metal trap that looked old and rusty. The woman was making soft sounds of pain, and her large amber eyes tracked his every movement as he approached slowly with his hands out where she could see them. Her skin had that blue-gray color that all Kalari had, and the glowing patterns on her arms were flickering, weakly like a candle about to go out. Jake knelt down beside the trap and looked at how the metal jaws had clamped around her lower leg. Blood stained the ground beneath her, and he could see she'd been trying to free herself for a while based on the marks in the dirt. He pulled out a pry bar from his tool belt and wedged it into the trap's mechanism. The woman hissed when he started working the spring loose, but she didn't try to pull away from him. The trap finally opened with a rusty screech, and Jake quickly pulled it off her leg. He took off his shirt and tore it into strips to wrap around the wound and slow the bleeding. The woman spoke to him in her own language, which sounded like musical tones and chimes that he couldn't understand at all. She tried to stand up, but her injured leg buckled under her weight, and she would have fallen if Jake hadn't caught her. Without asking if it was okay, Jake picked her up in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and her body went stiff for a moment before she seemed to accept that she needed his help. The walk back to his homestead took almost half an hour, and by the time he got there, the sky was dark and both moons had risen. He laid her down on his old couch and went to get water and whatever medical supplies he had in his cabinets. He remembered the translation device he'd bought years ago when he first arrived on New Helena. It was supposed to help humans and Kalari communicate, but he'd never had occasion to use it until now. The device was old and the screen was cracked, but when he turned it on, it still worked. He held it up and spoke slowly so the machine could convert his words into the musical language of the Kalari. "My name is Jake, and I want to help you." The device made a series of tones, and the woman's eyes focused on it with interest. She responded with her own musical phrase, and the device's screen showed a rough translation in human letters. "Kira and I am grateful." Jake spent the next hour cleaning and bandaging her leg properly, while the translation device sat between them, converting their halting conversation into something both could understand. Kira told him she was a scout for her tribe, and she'd been tracking poachers who'd been setting illegal traps in the treaty zones. The men were stealing eggs from protected creatures and harvesting rare plants that held spiritual meaning for her people. She'd been following their trail when she stepped into one of their traps and couldn't free herself. Her people would be looking for her, but she didn't know how long it would take them to find where she'd fallen. Jake made up the small guest room for her and helped her move from the couch to the bed. He brought her more water and some food, though he wasn't sure if she could eat human rations. Kira accepted the water but waved off the food and instead pulled a small packet from a pouch at her belt. Inside were compressed cakes that smelled sweet and nutty, and she offered one to Jake, who tried it and found it surprisingly good. Over the next 3 days, Kira stayed in Jake's homestead while her leg started to heal. The translation device got better at understanding both of them as it learned their speech patterns, and soon they could have almost normal conversations. Jake learned that Kira was part of the Windwalker tribe, which was one of the largest Kalari communities in this region. Her brother Valen was the war chief, and she said he would be very concerned about her disappearance. Jake told her about his ranch and how he'd come to New Helena after his family lost everything. In the economic collapse back on Earth, he'd used his last credits to buy this patch of land, hoping to build something of his own. The ranch barely made enough to keep him fed and his equipment running, but it was his, and that meant everything. Kira listened to his stories, and the glowing patterns on her skin would pulse in ways that Jake started to recognize as expressions of emotion. On the third morning, Jake suggested calling for medical help through his comm unit, but Kira refused. She touched the patterns on her arm and said her people already knew where she was and they would come soon. Jake didn't understand how that was possible, but he'd learned that the Kalari had abilities and technologies that humans didn't fully comprehend yet. That afternoon, Jake was working in his barn when he noticed movement on the horizon. 5 riders were approaching on sand runners, which were the 6-legged creatures that the Kalari had domesticated for transportation. Jake stepped out of the barn with his hands visible and empty as the riders got closer. The lead rider was tall, with elaborate glowing patterns that suggested high rank among his people. He dismounted with fluid grace and stood before Jake with an expression that was hard to read. Jake activated his translation device and spoke carefully. "Your scout Kira is inside and she is safe, but her leg was injured in a trap." The warrior's amber eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made him nervous, but the Kalari simply nodded and walked past him toward the homestead. Jake followed, wondering what was going to happen next and hoping he hadn't somehow violated some cultural rule he didn't know about. Inside, Kira was already sitting up, having heard the commotion outside. She spoke rapidly to the warriors in her musical language and gestured toward Jake several times during her explanation. The lead warrior listened carefully, then turned to face Jake directly. The translation device converted his words into something formal and precise. "You have aided our kin when you had no obligation to do so, and you have shown honor that few humans possess. The Windwalker tribe does not forget such debts." Jake felt embarrassed by the formal gratitude and waved it off. Anyone would have done the same because she needed help. The warrior's expression shifted in a way that might have been amusement. "You believe this, but it is not true, and most of your kind would have left her fearing our response or simply not caring. I am Valen, and I serve as war chief of the Windwalker tribe. My sister has told me of your kindness, and we wish to repay this debt. What do you require, Jake Morrison?" Jake shook his head at Valen's question about payment, and told him he didn't want anything because he hadn't helped Kira, expecting to get something in return. This seemed to frustrate the war chief, and his glowing patterns flickered in ways the translation device couldn't properly interpret. Kira spoke up from where she sat, and though Jake couldn't understand her words without the device, her tone suggested she was explaining something about his character to her brother. Valen's gaze moved around the modest homestead, taking in the worn furniture and patched walls and the general feeling of a place where someone was barely getting by. "You are a proud man, and this is good, but the Windwalker do not leave debts unpaid. We will find a way to honor what you have done." The warriors began preparing to leave, and 2 of them carefully helped Kira onto one of the sand runners. Before they departed, Valen approached Jake one final time. "The poachers you mentioned are violating the treaty and harming both our peoples. If you see them, stay away, because we will handle this matter." Jake nodded and told him to be careful because the men were armed and desperate. Valen's response came through the translator with a tone that suggested the poachers had made a serious mistake. "As are we." After the Kalari left, Jake stood in his dusty yard watching the sunset over his land. He felt relief that Kira was safely with her people, but also a strange emptiness in the homestead that had never bothered him before. For 3 days he'd had company and someone to talk to, even through a faulty translation device, and now the silence felt heavier than it used to. He went back to his work, fixing fences and tending livestock and trying to coax better yields from his struggling crops. A week passed, and then 2 more, and Jake assumed the whole incident was behind him. It would just be an unusual chapter in his quiet frontier life that he'd remember when he was old. Then, on the morning of the 15th day, he woke up and looked out his window to find a herd of sand runners in his north pasture. He counted 20 of the creatures, and each one was worth more than his entire ranch, and all his equipment combined. Sand runners were notoriously difficult to domesticate, and the Kalari had spent generations breeding lines that were suitable for riding and carrying loads. On the frontier markets, a single trained sand runner could fetch enough credits to set up a comfortable life in one of the colony cities. Standing among the herd were Valen and Kira, who was now walking without any visible limp. Jake grabbed his translation device and hurried out to meet them, still in his sleeping clothes. "What is this?" he asked while gesturing at the magnificent creatures. Valen's patterns glowed with what looked like satisfaction. "A beginning of payment, and these are young but well-trained. They will help your ranch prosper." Jake felt his throat go tight, and he tried to explain that he couldn't accept such a valuable gift because it was too much. Kira spoke, and her voice came through the translator with gentle firmness. "You gave aid expecting nothing, and we give gifts expecting your acceptance. To refuse is to say our gratitude has no value." When she put it that way, Jake realized he was trapped by an alien sense of honor he didn't fully understand, but had to respect. He looked at the sand runners and started imagining what he could do with them. They could pull heavier loads than his aging mechanical equipment, and they needed less maintenance, and could cross terrain his vehicles couldn't handle. Then, "I accept with thanks, but this settles any debt and you owe me nothing more." Valen's markings flickered in that untranslatable pattern again. "The debt will be settled when we say it is settled, and we have also brought workers to improve your dwelling and equipment." Before Jake could protest, a dozen more Kalari emerged from behind his homestead, already carrying materials and tools. They moved with clear purpose, having apparently surveyed his property before he woke up. Over the next month, Jake's ranch was transformed in ways he never could have managed on his own. The Kalari workers repaired his leaking roof and reinforced his barn, and installed a water reclamation system that used technology he'd only read about in expensive agricultural journals. They taught him how to care for the sand runners and showed him the commands and treatments the creatures responded to. The animals were intelligent and formed bonds with their handlers, and Jake found himself growing attached to them in ways he never had with his old machinery. Kira visited frequently during this time, and she often brought food from her people. There were preserved fruits that tasted like nothing Jake had ever experienced, and grain cakes that stayed fresh for weeks, and a fermented drink the translator called celebration water, but which tasted like spiced honey. Through these visits, Jake and Kira developed a friendship that went beyond the initial rescue. The translation device became less necessary as they learned to communicate through gestures and expressions and the peculiar mixed language that emerges when two species try to bridge the gap between their worlds. She told him about Kalari culture and their connection to the land that went deeper than human concepts of ownership. The planet wasn't something they possessed, but something they belonged to, and it was a subtle but profound distinction that Jake found himself thinking about often. Their glowing patterns weren't just decoration, but a form of communication that conveyed emotions and intentions that words couldn't fully capture. Each tribe had their own pattern variations, and trained Kalari could read complex messages in the pulses and colors. Jake shared stories about Earth and about a world so crowded and polluted that it seemed like a cautionary tale. He told her about oceans that stretched to the horizon and cities with billions of people packed into towers that reached the clouds. He explained the desperation that had driven humanity to the stars looking for new homes and new resources, and how colony worlds like New Helena represented hope for people who had nothing left on Earth. "Your people are wanderers," Kira observed one evening, as they sat on Jake's newly repaired porch watching the double moons rise over the scrubland, always seeking and never settling in one place for long. Jake thought about that and shook his head. "Some of us settle, and I'm done wandering because this is home now." Kira's patterns pulsed with what Jake had learned to recognize as approval and contentment. "Then you understand more than most humans, and to have a home is to have a purpose." The transformation of his ranch changed Jake's standing in the small human community scattered across this region. Other ranchers started visiting to see the sand runners and the new equipment, and to ask how he'd managed to earn such favor from the Kalari. Some were genuinely curious and wanted to learn from his experience, while others were suspicious and thought he must be running some kind of scheme. Jake tried to explain that he'd simply helped someone who needed it, but that answer seemed too simple for most people to accept. Human trader named Colin stopped by one afternoon and walked around the property with obvious envy in his eyes. "You've got yourself quite a setup here, Morrison, and I'm wondering what it cost you." Jake told him it hadn't cost anything except doing the right thing when it mattered. Colin laughed like that was a joke. "Nothing's free, especially not from aliens, and they'll want something from you eventually. You mark my words." But weeks turned into months, and the Kalari never asked for anything in return. Valen visited occasionally to check on the sand runners and to share news about the region. The poachers had been caught trying to cross into another tribe's territory, and they were now facing justice under both human and Kalari law. The treaty councils were taking the violations seriously because both sides recognized that a few bad actors could destroy the fragile peace they'd built. Jake's herd grew healthier, with the better water system, and his crops started producing yields he'd only dreamed about before. He was actually making a profit for the first time since coming to New Helena, and he found himself able to buy supplies and equipment he'd been putting off for years. He hired 2 human workers to help with the increased workload, and both of them were young people trying to make their own way on the frontier. One was a quiet man named Peter who'd come from one of the failing colony cities looking for honest work, and the other was a woman named Linda who'd grown up on a ranch on Earth and knew more about animal husbandry than Jake had forgotten. They both adapted quickly to working with the Sandrunners, and neither of them seemed bothered by the occasional Kalari visitors who stopped by to check on the animals or deliver supplies. Life settled into a new rhythm that felt both strange and right. Jake would wake before dawn and work alongside his crew until the sun got too hot. Then they'd rest during the middle of the day and work again in the evening when it cooled off. Kira visited at least once a week, and they'd share meals and talk about everything and nothing. She was teaching him her language properly now, and he was teaching her more human words than the translator provided. Their conversations ranged from philosophy to practical matters, and Jake valued her perspective on problems he was facing. The ranch that had been barely surviving was now thriving, and Jake knew it was all because he'd made one choice on one afternoon to help someone in pain. He hadn't expected gratitude or payment or friendship, but he'd received all 3, and it had changed his life in ways he was still trying to fully understand. The peaceful months came to an abrupt end on a cool autumn morning when Jake walked out to check on his Sandrunners and found 3 of them missing. The tracks in the dirt were clear enough even for his untrained eyes, and they told a story he didn't want to believe. Human boot prints and drag marks from nets and the deep gouges where the animals had resisted being taken. The poachers had grown bold enough to strike his property directly. Jake immediately used the communication crystal the Kalari had given him for emergencies. It was a smooth piece of what looked like blue glass, but when he held it and thought about Valen, it grew warm in his hand. Within an hour, a dozen Kalari warriors had assembled at his ranch, and Valen and Kira were among them. The war chief examined the tracks with expert eyes, while his warriors spread out to gather more information from the surrounding area. "They escalate," Valen said while crouching near the clearest boot print. "They know you are under our protection now, yet they dare this, and it is a challenge to both of us." Jake told him he was coming with them to track the thieves, and Valen started to object, but Kira placed a hand on her brother's arm. "He has earned this right because they struck his home." Valen looked at Jake for a long moment, then nodded once in acceptance. The tracking party moved out before the sun reached its peak, and they followed the trail southeast into the broken lands where rocky canyons and twisted vegetation made perfect hiding spots for those who didn't want to be found. Jake rode one of his remaining Sandrunners, and he was surprised at how natural it felt after months of practice. The animal seemed to sense his determination and moved with sure-footed confidence over the rough terrain. The Kalari moved through the landscape like they were part of it, and they read signs that Jake was only beginning to understand. A broken twig here and disturbed soil there, and the particular way certain plants bent when something large passed through. Each small detail was a word in the story the land was telling, and the Kalari could read it like humans read books. They moved in near silence, with hand signals replacing spoken commands, and Jake did his best to follow their lead. On the second day of tracking, they found the poachers' camp tucked into a narrow canyon with high walls. There were 7 men with weapons and equipment that suggested they'd been operating for months at least. The stolen Sandrunners were tied near a makeshift corral, and they looked agitated and poorly treated. Jake felt anger rise in his chest at seeing the magnificent creatures being handled so roughly. Valen organized his warriors with the precision of someone who'd led many raids before. They surrounded the camp while the poachers were eating their midday meal, and most of the thieves didn't even know the Kalari were there until it was too late. When Valen gave the signal, his warriors moved in like shadows, and they disarmed the men before most of them could even reach for their weapons. The Kalari were fast, and their combat training was evident in every movement. One poacher managed to grab a rifle, and he was a scarred man who appeared to be the group's leader. He pointed the weapon at Kira, who had moved into the camp ahead of the others. Jake didn't think or plan or consider his options, and he just lunged forward and tackled the man before he could fire. They tumbled across the rocky ground, and Jake felt sharp pain as his shoulder struck a stone and something in it crunched in a way that made him see stars. Kalari warriors pulled the poacher away from Jake and secured him with the others, who were now bound and sitting in a line. Kira helped Jake to his feet, and her patterns pulsed with concern. "You are injured." Jake tried to tell her he was fine, but his shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, and he knew it was more than just a bruise. He'd probably cracked something, but he'd worry about that later. Valen approached the captured poachers, and his presence seemed to fill the canyon with authority. "You have violated treaty law, and you have stolen from both our peoples. Under the Accords, you will be judged by both human and Kalari justice." The scarred leader spat on the ground near Valen's feet and sneered at the warriors surrounding them. "Your people don't scare us, and more humans are coming to this world every day. Soon there won't be room for both of us." Valen's expression remained calm, but his patterns flickered in a way Jake now recognized as controlled anger. "Then those humans will learn what you are learning now. This world does not belong to those who take, but it belongs to those who honor it." The other poachers looked less confident than their leader, and a few of them were staring at the Kalari warriors with obvious fear. They'd probably heard stories about what happened to people who violated the treaties, and those stories were apparently not comforting. The prisoners were bound and prepared for transport to the nearest human settlement, where authorities would coordinate with the Kalari Council for prosecution. Jake's sand runners were freed and inspected for injuries, and fortunately they'd only been taken a day before and hadn't been seriously harmed. The animals recognized Jake and pressed against him, making soft sounds of distress and relief. He spent time calming each of them and checking them over while his injured shoulder sent waves of pain through his body. As the party prepared to return, Kira approached Jake with a medical kit. "Let me see your shoulder." Jake winced as she probed the injury with gentle fingers that still managed to find every sore spot. "It's just bruised," he lied. Kira's patterns pulsed with what might have been exasperation. "You moved without thinking to protect me, and this is twice now you have shown such honor. My brother sees this, and our people see this." "Anyone would have done the same," Jake started to say, but Kira interrupted him with unusual firmness. "No, and anyone would not. You must stop saying this and accept that you are different, Jake Morrison. Accept that this matters." She wrapped his shoulder with bandages that had some kind of cooling gel in them, and the pain immediately lessened. The Kalari had medical technology that was more advanced than standard human frontier supplies, and Jake was grateful for it. The journey back took 3 days, because the poachers slowed them down and Jake's injured shoulder made riding difficult. But they made it back to his ranch without incident, and the human authorities were waiting to take custody of the prisoners. A colonial marshal named Helen had come personally, and she questioned Jake about the incident while writing everything down in her official report. "So you tracked down armed criminals with a group of Kalari warriors," Helen said while looking at him like he'd grown a second head. "That's either very brave or very stupid, Morrison." Jake told her the men had stolen his property and threatened people he cared about, so he'd done what needed to be done. Helen shook her head, but there was respect in her eyes. "The treaty councils are going to want full statements from everyone involved, and this is going to be a test case for how we handle joint enforcement operations." The poachers were loaded into a transport vehicle and taken away to face trial. Their leader was still defiant and shouting threats about how more humans would come and push the Kalari off their land. But the other prisoners looked defeated and scared, and Jake suspected they'd cooperate with investigators in exchange for lighter sentences. The whole thing left a bad taste in his mouth, and he was glad when it was over. That evening, Valen gathered his warriors and prepared to return to Windwalker territory. He approached Jake and placed a hand on his good shoulder, and what Jake had learned was a gesture of respect among the Kalari. "You fought beside us today and protected my sister at cost to yourself. This adds to the debt we owe you." Jake tried to protest, but Valen just smiled in that way that showed he wouldn't be argued with. "The debt grows, Jake Morrison, and we will find ways to honor it." After the Kalari left, Jake sat on his porch with Linda and Peter, who'd stayed to help secure the ranch while he was gone. Linda brought him something to drink and asked if his shoulder was going to be okay. Jake nodded and said the Kalari medicine was working better than anything human doctors could have provided. Peter asked what it had been like tracking with the Kalari warriors, and Jake tried to explain the experience, but words seemed inadequate. "They move like they're part of the land itself," Jake finally said, "and they can read signs I can't even see. Fighting beside them was like watching artists work, but with violence instead of paint. Linda and Peter both looked impressed and maybe a little envious. The younger generation of settlers seemed more open to the Kalari than the older folks who'd come to New Helena, with prejudices already formed. Word of the poacher incident spread through both human and Kalari communities faster than Jake expected, and suddenly his ranch became a topic of conversation across the entire region. For the human settlers, he was an oddity and a poor rancher, who'd somehow earned the respect and friendship of the notoriously private natives. Some people admired what he'd done, while others viewed him with suspicion and wondered what angle he was playing or what he was really getting from the arrangement. For the Kalari, particularly the Windwalker tribe, Jake represented something more significant. He was proof that humans and Kalari could work together, not just peacefully but cooperatively. Valen began bringing other tribe members to visit the ranch, and he introduced Jake to elders and craftspeople and warriors. Through these interactions, Jake found himself becoming an unofficial bridge between the two communities, even though he'd never asked for such a role. Human ranchers, who'd never spoken to a Kalari, started coming to Jake with questions about trade and land management and cultural practices they didn't understand. Kalari traders who wanted to learn about human market systems sought his advice on pricing and contracts and how to negotiate with colonial merchants. Jake did his best to help everyone while feeling completely unqualified for the responsibility that had somehow fallen on his shoulders. His ranch continued to prosper beyond anything he'd imagined possible just a year ago. The sand runners proved invaluable for working the land, and the improved infrastructure allowed him to expand his operations. He hired 2 young Kalari who wanted to learn human ranching techniques, and their addition to his crew created the first truly mixed human Kalari work team in the region. One was a male named Dren who had a natural gift for working with livestock, and the other was a female named Lissa who showed remarkable skill with machinery and the complex water systems. At first, Linda and Peter were uncertain about working alongside Kalari, but within a week they developed an easy camaraderie based on mutual respect and shared labor. Dren taught them Kalari techniques for reading weather patterns and understanding animal behavior, while Linda showed him human methods for breeding selection and health management. Lissa and Peter spent hours working on equipment together, and they developed a friendship built on their shared love of fixing broken things. Jake's homestead became a gathering place and a neutral ground where both species could interact informally. Evening meals often included a mix of human and Kalari guests, sharing food and stories around the fire pit that Jake had expanded to accommodate larger groups. The translation devices became less necessary as people learned bits of each other's languages and developed the mixed communication style that worked for practical purposes. It was during one of these gatherings, about 6 months after the poacher incident, that Valen made an announcement that stunned everyone present. The Windwalker Council has made a decision, and we wish to propose an expansion of the treaty between our peoples, a joint settlement where humans and Kalari can live and work together and learn from each other and build something new. The gathered humans murmured with surprise and interest because such a thing had never been attempted on New Helena. Valen continued, and his patterns glowed with intensity. We propose that this settlement be built on land adjacent to Jake Morrison's ranch, with Jake serving as the human coordinator for the project. Jake nearly choked on his drink and had to cough several times before he could speak. "Footin' Valen, I'm not a politician or a diplomat. I'm just a rancher who got lucky." Kira smiled, and her patterns pulsed with warmth. "You are a bridge, Jake, and you have already brought our peoples together in ways the formal treaties never could. Who better to guide this new beginning?" The proposal generated intense debate among both communities over the following weeks. Some humans were excited about the opportunity, while others were suspicious of Kalari motives. Some Kalari saw it as a natural evolution of peaceful coexistence, while others worried about losing their cultural identity. Jake found himself in meeting after meeting trying to address concerns and explain a vision he was still figuring out himself. A human council representative named Gordon came to the ranch to discuss the legal and administrative challenges. "You understand this has never been done before, Morrison, and we're talking about creating a completely new type of settlement under both human and Kalari jurisdiction. The paperwork alone is going to be a nightmare." Jake told him they'd figure it out because the alternative was to keep living separately and missing the chance to build something better. The planning process took 2 years, and it involved more meetings and discussions, and compromises than Jake had thought possible. Every decision required input from both human and Kalari representatives, and there were disagreements and misunderstandings and moments when the whole project seemed ready to collapse. But Jake learned that leadership wasn't about having all the answers, and it was about listening and facilitating and occasionally knocking stubborn heads together when necessary. They chose a site about 3 miles from Jake's ranch where a natural spring provided water and the land was suitable for both human and Kalari building styles. The settlement was named Bridges End after much debate, and it worked in both languages while representing the idea that this was where the journey of separation would conclude and a new shared path would begin. The name felt right to Jake, and when they held the official naming ceremony, both communities celebrated together. Construction began in the spring, and it was slow, careful work. They built homes that incorporated design elements from both cultures and created architecture that was uniquely suited to New Helena's environment while respecting both aesthetic traditions. The human preference for right angles and enclosed spaces merged with the Kalari love of flowing curves and open-air structures. The result was buildings that looked like nothing else in the galaxy, and Jake thought they were beautiful in their strangeness. The settlement started small with just 20 families volunteering to be the first residents. 10 families were human, and 10 were Kalari, and they'd all been carefully selected for their willingness to embrace this experiment. They included farmers and craftspeople and teachers and merchants, and their diversity was intentional. The goal was to create a complete community, not just a symbolic gesture. Jake worked alongside the construction crews and helped build the shared spaces that would serve as the heart of Bridges End. There was a market where goods could be traded and a medical facility that would be staffed by both human doctors and Kalari, healers, and a school where children of both species would learn together. This last part was perhaps the most radical and most important because the young ones would grow up knowing each other as neighbors and friends rather than as mysterious strangers. Kira became the Kalari coordinator for Bridges End, and she worked alongside Jake, handling the inevitable problems that arose. Their friendship had deepened into something neither of them could quite define. And it wasn't romance exactly, because the species differences made that complicated, but it was a bond that went beyond mere friendship, and she was his closest confidant and the person he trusted most in the world. Late one night, as they reviewed plans for the settlement's water distribution system, Kira set down her tablet and looked at Jake with an expression he'd learned meant she was about to say something important. "Do you remember what you told me when we first spoke through that terrible translation device?" Jake thought back to those early days. "I told you a lot of things. You said this was home and that you were done wandering." Her patterns pulsed softly. "I think you have created something more than a home, Jake Morrison, and you have created a future." Jake looked out the window at Bridges End, where construction lights illuminated the growing settlement against the night sky. "We created it, and all of us together." Kira shook her head gently. "It began with one person choosing kindness over fear, and everything else followed from that choice." Jake didn't know what to say to that, and he just nodded and went back to studying the water system plans while feeling the weight of what they were building pressing down on his shoulders in a way that was both heavy and strangely comforting. The first year of Bridges End was harder than anyone had anticipated, and Jake found himself dealing with problems he'd never imagined. The human families complained about the Kalari habit of singing during their dawn meditations, and the Kalari families found human cooking smells unpleasant. Children from both species had playground conflicts that their parents turned into diplomatic incidents. The shared medical facility ran into problems when human doctors and Kalari healers disagreed on treatment approaches. Jake spent his days mediating disputes and explaining cultural differences and reminding everyone why they'd chosen to be part of this experiment. At night, he'd return to his ranch exhausted and wondering if this whole thing was a mistake. But then he'd see small victories like human and Kalari children playing together, or families sharing meals, or the way the settlement was developing its own unique culture, and he'd find the energy to keep going. Kira was essential to making it work, and her patience seemed unlimited even when Jake's was running thin. She could speak to the Kalari families in ways that Jake couldn't, and she understood the nuances of their concerns. Together, they developed systems for handling conflicts, and they created guidelines that respected both cultures while building something new. The translation devices were still necessary for formal meetings, but every day, Communication was evolving into a blend of both languages. The school was where the real magic happened, and the children adapted far more quickly than their parents. Within months, the young ones were playing together with the unself-conscious ease of kids who hadn't yet learned to see differences as barriers. They invented games that combined elements from both cultures, and they created a playground language that mixed human and Kalari words freely. The teachers from both species reported that the children were learning faster than in traditional schools, and they attributed it to the cross-cultural exchange. A human teacher named Beth told Jake about a project where human and Kalari children had worked together to build a scale model of the settlement. The Kalari children had taught the humans how to read the land and choose the best locations for buildings, while the human children had shared mathematical concepts for measuring and planning. The result was a model that was more sophisticated than anything either group could have created alone. The market became another success story, and it operated 3 days a week with vendors from both species selling goods and trading for things they needed. Human farmers discovered that Kalari preservation techniques could extend the life of their produce, while Kalari craftspeople found markets for their art among human buyers. A system of dual pricing emerged where items could be purchased with either human credits or Kalari trade goods, and merchants from both cultures learned to navigate both systems. Jake watched an elderly human woman named Ruth haggling with a Kalari vendor over a piece of woven cloth, and the interaction was friendly despite the language barriers. Ruth held up 3 fingers and said her offer in simple words, while the vendor responded with hand gestures and a musical phrase that his translation device rendered as asking for 4. They settled on a price somewhere in the middle, and both walked away looking satisfied. The medical facility took longer to find its rhythm, but eventually human doctors and Kalari healers learned to work together. A human doctor named Paul initially resisted Kalari healing methods, which used sonic frequencies and bioluminescent therapies that seemed like superstition. But when a Kalari healer named Soren successfully treated a human patient's chronic pain using frequency therapy, Paul became willing to learn. By the end of the first year, they were consulting on cases together and combining their approaches. Bridges End attracted attention from across New Helena and from other colony worlds. Delegations came to observe and study what was being built, and they asked endless questions about how the integration was working. Some visitors were genuinely interested in replicating the model, while others seemed to be looking for evidence that it was failing. Jake gave the same answer to everyone and told them it was hard work and required commitment from both sides and wasn't perfect, but it was worth doing. The colonial governor herself visited after 18 months, and she walked through the settlement with Jake and Kira, asking questions and taking notes. Governor Walsh was a practical woman who'd seen many idealistic projects fail, and she seemed skeptical at first. But as she observed the children playing together and families interacting and the way the community functioned, she started to look thoughtful. This could change everything, Morrison Walsh said as they stood in the market watching the activity. If this works here, it could work anywhere, and we could finally move beyond the cold peace we've had with the Kalari. Jake told her it was already working, and the evidence was all around them. Walsh nodded slowly. I'm going to recommend increased support from the colonial administration, and we'll see about making Bridges End an official model for integration. True to her word, Walsh secured funding and resources that helped Bridges End expand. The settlement grew to 50 families by the end of the second year, and then to 100 by the third. Each wave of new residents brought challenges, but also energy and ideas. The original 20 families became informal mentors to the newcomers, and they passed on the lessons they'd learned about making integration work. Jake's ranch remained separate but adjacent, and it served as a reminder of where everything had started. He still worked the land with his mixed crew, though now he had more help than he needed. Linda had married Peter in a ceremony that included elements from both human and Kalari traditions, and they'd built a home in Bridges End. Dren had returned to his tribe for a time, but came back with a Kalari partner, and they too settled in the growing community. Kira practically lived at Bridges End now, though she maintained a dwelling in Windwalker territory as well. She and Jake had fallen into a partnership that felt as natural as breathing, and they could often communicate without words just from long practice. Her brother Valen visited regularly, and he took obvious pride in what his sister and Jake had built together. The Windwalker tribe had become the strongest Advocates for integration and other Kalari tribes were starting to take notice. Not everyone was happy about the changes, and there was resistance from both human and Kalari traditionalists. A group of human settlers formed an organization called the Heritage Coalition, and they argued that humans needed to preserve their culture and not dilute it through mixing with aliens. On the Kalari side, some tribes saw integration as a threat to their way of life and worried that younger generations would lose connection to their traditions. Jake faced these critics at public meetings, and he tried to address their concerns honestly. He acknowledged that change was difficult and that some traditions would inevitably evolve. But he argued that cultures weren't static things to be preserved in amber, and they'd always grown and adapted through contact with others. The choice wasn't between change and preservation, but between growing together or growing apart. A heated debate happened at the colonial capital, where Jake and Kira presented their model to a joint session of human and Kalari representatives. A human delegate named Richard stood up and demanded to know what would happen to human identity if this integration spread. Jake looked at the man and spoke calmly. Our identity isn't so fragile that it can't survive contact with another culture, and if it is, then maybe it needs to evolve. We're not losing who we are, and we're becoming something new. A Kalari elder named Morin spoke next, and her patterns flickered with ancient authority. The young human speaks wisdom, and our peoples have lived separately on this world for a generation, and what has it brought us? Suspicion and conflict and wasted opportunities. Let us see what cooperation brings. The session ended without a formal vote, but the momentum had clearly shifted in favor of supporting integration efforts. As Bridges End approached its 4th year, Jake took an evening to walk through the settlement alone. The streets were quiet, with families settling in for the night and lights glowing from windows of homes built in that unique hybrid style. He passed the school, where a mural painted by students showed human and Kalari children holding hands under New Helena's double moons. He walked through the market, where vendors had closed up for the day, leaving behind the mixed smells of human and Kalari commerce. Standing in the central square, Jake thought about how far they'd come from that afternoon when he'd found Kira in a trap. He'd just wanted to help someone in pain, and now he was somehow responsible for a community that was changing the face of their world. The weight of it still felt heavy, but it also felt right, and he couldn't imagine doing anything else. 5 years after Jake first helped Kira, the message came that would change everything. Valen arrived at the ranch early one morning with news that made Jake's hands shake as he held his morning coffee. The Council of 17 had been called, and it was the first pan-tribal gathering in living memory. Representatives from 17 different Kalari tribes across New Helena would assemble at a sacred site near Windwalker territory, and they wanted Jake to attend as a witness. Valen explained as they prepared for the journey. What you helped create has reached far beyond this region, and other tribes see that coexistence is possible. Humans need not be invaders to be resisted, but can be partners in preserving our world. This gathering will determine the future of Kalari-human relations across the entire planet. Jake felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders, and he asked what they wanted from him. Your presence and your truth, Valen replied. You will speak if called upon, but mostly you will observe. The journey to the sacred site took 3 days on Sandrunner back, and Jake traveled with Valen and Kira and a dozen Windwalker warriors. They crossed territories Jake had never seen and passed through lands that took his breath away with their stark beauty. Towering rock formations carved by wind and canyons so deep their bottoms disappeared into shadow, and plains of crystalline sand that glittered under the double suns like scattered diamonds. They passed through territories belonging to other tribes, and Jake saw the diversity of Kalari culture. Each tribe had distinctive patterns and customs and ways of adapting to their environments. The desert dancers who lived in the hot southern regions had developed heat-resistant adaptations, and their patterns ran in warm oranges and reds. The mountain singers from the northern peaks had thicker builds for the cold, and their patterns were cool, blues and purples. The sacred site was a natural amphitheater carved into red stone by millennia of wind and water. It was a bowl of rock that could hold thousands, and Jake felt small as they descended into it. Kalari from all 17 tribes were already gathering, and their various patterns created a display of bioluminescent communication that was almost overwhelming. Each tribe had set up temporary camps around the edges of the amphitheater, and the mingled sounds of their different dialects created a symphony of musical tones. Jake was given a place of honor near the center floor. where the speakers would address the assembly. He sat on a stone bench worn smooth by countless previous gatherings and tried not to think about the hundreds of Kalari eyes watching him. Kira sat beside him and she touched his arm in a gesture of comfort. They honor you by allowing your presence, and no human has ever witnessed a council of 17. Speak truth if asked and trust that we want you here. Elder Morin, who Jake had met before, opened the gathering with words that the translation device rendered into formal archaic language. We gather to speak of the humans who walk our world, and for 3 generations we have watched them arrive and settle and take. We have maintained peace through the treaties, but it has been a cold peace built on distance and mutual wariness. The assembled Kalari pulsed their patterns in what seemed to be agreement. Morin continued, and her ancient eyes found Jake among the crowd. Then one human poor in material wealth but rich in character chose kindness, and he helped one of our people expecting nothing in return. From this single act, a new possibility emerged. She gestured to Kira. Tell us, daughter of Windwalker, what happened. Kira stood and spoke in her own language, and her words flowed like music across the amphitheater. Jake's translation device rendered it into human speech, but he knew it was losing the emotional nuances. She told the story of being trapped and Jake finding her and his care for her injury. She spoke of his refusal of payment and his genuine friendship and the way he'd fought beside Kalari warriors to protect what was right. She described Bridges End and the children playing together and the future being built there. When she finished, many Kalari pulsed their patterns, and what Jake had learned was applause. Another elder stood, and this one was from a tribe Jake didn't recognize. The Windwalker have shown us that humans can be more than takers. But one human and one settlement is not enough to change our policy for the whole world. What guarantee do we have that other humans will act with such honor? There was a murmur of patterns in agreement, and Jake felt the skepticism in the air. Balin rose to respond, and his voice carried the authority of a war chief. Then let us make it more than one, and the Bridges End model can be replicated. We can create a network of joint settlements, building a society where both our peoples thrive together. We have the proof that it works, and we have seen the children of both species growing up as friends. This is the future if we have the courage to embrace it. The debate continued for hours, with arguments for and against closer integration. Some tribes spoke of past conflicts and broken promises and fears that humans would eventually outnumber and dominate them. Others spoke of the benefits they'd already seen from limited cooperation and the potential for greater prosperity through partnership. Jake listened to it all and tried to understand the depth of feeling on both sides. A young warrior from the Mountain Singer tribe stood and pointed at Jake. This human may have shown honor, but what of the others? What of the poachers and the ones who violate our sacred sites and the corporations that want to strip our land of resources? How do we trust a species that seems to value profit over preservation? Jake wanted to respond, but Morin raised her hand and he stayed silent. Elder Morin spoke into the tension. The young warrior asks a fair question, and humans have given us many reasons for distrust. But the Kalari have also made mistakes, and we have sometimes met fear with hostility, when openness might have served better. The question is not whether humans are perfect, but whether cooperation serves us better than separation. She paused, and her patterns glowed with intensity. I am old and I have seen much, and I tell you that isolation leads to stagnation, while contact brings growth. Another elder stood, and this one was female, with patterns that suggested great age and wisdom. I am Shala of the River Keepers, and we have maintained distance from humans by choice. But I have watched my tribe's children grow curious about the humans they see from afar, and I have watched opportunities for trade and learning pass us by. Perhaps the time for distance has ended. Her words seemed to shift the mood in the amphitheater. As the double moons rose above the stone walls, Morin called for the formal decision. The vote would be conducted through the complex bioluminescent communication that was the traditional method for such important matters. Jake watched as patterns of light rippled through the assembled Kalari, and his translation device couldn't begin to interpret the complexity of what was happening. It went on for nearly an hour, and then suddenly the patterns synchronized into a unified pulse that lit up the entire amphitheater. Morin's patterns glowed with emotion as she spoke. The council has spoken, and we will embrace the path of integration. We will invite humans to join us in building a shared future for New Helena, and we will support the creation of more settlements like Bridges End. She turned to face Jake directly. And we declare that Jake Morrison, the poor rancher who showed us the possibility of this future, shall be named Friend of all Tribes, and it is the first time a human has held such an honor. Jake stood, Overwhelmed as the assembled Kalari created a symphony of bioluminescent light and recognition. The patterns were so bright and so synchronized that they illuminated the amphitheater like daylight, and Jake felt tears running down his face without shame. Kira appeared beside him and her own patterns danced with happiness. You changed everything and you changed the destiny of our world. Jake shook his head and his voice was rough with emotion. I just helped someone who needed it and that's all I did. Kira smiled and touched his face gently. Yes, and that was enough and that was everything. The celebration continued late into the night with Kalari from different tribes mingling and discussing the future. Jake found himself surrounded by tribe leaders asking questions about Bridges End and how to implement similar settlements in their regions. He did his best to answer while still processing what had just happened and what it would mean. An elder from the Desert Dancers approached and introduced herself as Vera. We would like to establish a joint settlement in our territory and we would value your guidance, Jake Morrison, friend of all tribes. Jake told her he would help however he could, and that the key was finding humans and Kalari who were committed to making it work. Vera's patterns pulsed with determination. We will find such people because the alternative is to remain forever apart, and that serves no one. The decision of the Council of 17 sent shockwaves through both human and Kalari societies across New Helena. Within months of the gathering, proposals for joint settlements began appearing in regions Jake had never even heard of. The colonial government struggled to keep up with the administrative demands, and new departments were created specifically to handle integration initiatives. Governor Walsh appointed Jake as special advisor on Kalari relations, and he tried to refuse, but she told him the job was his whether he wanted it or not. Jake's life became a whirlwind of travel and meetings and consultations. He visited proposed settlement sites across the planet and met with tribal leaders and human administrators and community organizers. Each region had unique challenges based on local geography and tribal customs and existing human populations. The Desert Dancers wanted their settlement, built around ancient hot springs that had spiritual significance, while the Mountain Singers needed structures that could withstand harsh winters and heavy snow. Kira traveled with him as co-advisor, and their partnership became the public face of successful integration. They gave presentations at colonial assemblies and tribal councils and university symposiums. They wrote guidelines for establishing joint settlements and trained coordinators who would oversee new communities. The work was exhausting but also exhilarating, because they were literally helping to shape the future of an entire world. Bridges End continued to grow and prosper, and it became a required stop for anyone interested in integration. Delegations from other colony worlds started arriving to study the model, and some were from planets where human-alien relations were tense or hostile. A group from New Britannia, where humans and the native Quilon barely tolerated each other, spent 2 weeks observing Bridges End and interviewing residents. Their leader was a skeptical bureaucrat named Lawrence who seemed determined to find flaws. But after watching Kalari and human children playing together in the schoolyard and seeing mixed families sharing meals and observing the easy cooperation in the marketplace, Lawrence's skepticism began to crack. On his last day, he sought out Jake for a private conversation. I came here expecting to find a facade, Morrison, and I thought this was probably propaganda covering up tensions beneath the surface. But it's real, and these people genuinely like each other. Jake told him it wasn't magic, and it was just people choosing every day to make it work. Lawrence looked thoughtful as he watched a Kalari mother helping a human child who'd fallen and scraped his knee. We've been doing everything wrong on New Britannia, and we've kept the Quilon at arm's length and taught our children to fear them. I'm going back to recommend we establish a Bridges End model settlement, and I don't know if it will work, but we have to try. Jake shook his hand and told him to reach out if they needed help and that the mistakes they'd make would be their own, but learning from others could save time. By the end of the 6th year after Jake first helped Kira, there were 15 joint settlements across New Helena, with more in planning stages. Each settlement had its own character based on the tribes and human communities involved, but they all shared the core principles of mutual respect and cooperation and integration. The total population living in joint settlements had grown to over 20,000, and demographic projections suggested it would double within 5 years. The economic impact was significant, and trade between human and Kalari communities increased dramatically. Kalari artisans found eager markets for their crafts while human technology was adapted to Kalari needs and preferences. Joint ventures emerged with mixed ownership and combined expertise, producing innovations that neither species could have developed alone. A human engineer named Carlos partnered with a Kalari craftsperson named Thane to create a new type of solar collector. That was more efficient than existing designs, and they were making a fortune, selling it across the colony. The most profound changes were happening with the younger generation. Children who grew up in joint settlements were truly bicultural, and they moved easily between human and Kalari social contexts. They spoke both languages fluently and understood the customs and values of both peoples. Some human parents worried their children were losing their human identity, while some Kalari parents had similar concerns, but the children themselves seemed perfectly comfortable with their hybrid culture. Jake visited a school in one of the newer settlements and watched a classroom where human and Kalari children were working together on a science project about New Helena's ecosystem. The teacher was human, but her assistant was Kalari, and they team-taught using methods from both educational traditions. A human girl named Sophie was partnered with a Kalari boy named Kel, and they were building a model of the local watershed complete with tiny representations of plants and animals. Sophie explained their project with enthusiasm. "We're showing how the water cycle works differently here than on Earth, because of the double sun system. And Kel taught me about how the Kalari have always managed water sustainably," Kel added in accented but clear human speech. "And Sophie showed me the mathematical models that predict future water needs based on population growth. And it is very useful." The two children smiled at each other with the easy friendship of kids who'd never known a world where humans and Kalari weren't partners. Not. Everything was smooth, and there were still conflicts and misunderstandings, and resistance from traditionalists on both sides. A joint settlement in the Northern Highlands failed after 2 years, when the participating tribe decided the cultural costs were too high and asked the humans to leave. The withdrawal was peaceful, but it was a reminder that integration wasn't automatic or guaranteed. Jake visited the site afterward and talked with both the departing humans and the Kalari who'd made the decision. The tribe's elder was apologetic, but firm. "We tried, and we found that our young people were losing connection to our ancestors and to the old ways. Perhaps in the future we will try again, but for now we need time to preserve what makes us who we are." Jake understood and told them there was no shame in recognizing when something wasn't working. Integration had to be voluntary and sustainable for all parties, and forced cooperation helped no one. But for every settlement that struggled, 3 more succeeded, and the overall trend was clearly positive. Governor Walsh commissioned a comprehensive study of integration's effects, and the results were presented at a major conference that drew attendees from across the sector. The data showed reduced conflict between communities, and increased economic prosperity, and higher satisfaction rates among residents of joint settlements compared to traditional settlements. Jake was asked to give the keynote address, and he stood before an audience of hundreds feeling completely out of his depth. He wasn't a speaker or a scholar, and he was just a rancher who'd made one choice that had somehow led to all of this. But Kira squeezed his hand before he walked to the podium and reminded him to speak his truth. He talked about finding Kira in that trap and making the choice to help without thinking about consequences or rewards. He spoke about learning that kindness wasn't weakness and that opening yourself to another culture didn't diminish your own identity, but enriched it. He described watching Bridges End grow from a risky experiment into a thriving community and seeing that same transformation happening across the planet. And he emphasized that none of it had been easy, and that building bridges required constant work and patience and willingness to admit mistakes. The audience gave him a standing ovation, and afterward dozens of people wanted to talk with him about starting integration projects on their own worlds. A diplomat from the Epsilon colonies told Jake they were facing similar challenges with their native populations and asked if he'd consider consulting. Jake declined politely and said his work was here on New Helena, but there were others now who could help, and he introduced her to several coordinators who'd successfully established joint settlements. Jake's ranch had become almost symbolic, and it was maintained as a reminder of humble beginnings, even though Jake spent less time there than he would have liked. Linda and Peter managed the day-to-day operations with their mixed crew, and the ranch continued to prosper. The original sand runners that the Windwalker had gifted were now breeding stock, and their offspring were valued throughout the region for their temperament and Training. On quiet evenings when Jake could escape his official duties, he would return to the ranch and sit on the porch with Kira watching the sunset. They'd talk about the challenges ahead and the settlements being planned and the resistance they still faced. But mostly they'd sit in comfortable silence and watch the lights of Bridges End glowing in the distance, and remember how far they'd come from that afternoon when kindness had changed everything. 10 years after Jake Morrison found Kira in that trap, New Helena had become known across the settled galaxy as the success story of human-alien integration. Scholars studied it and politicians cited it, and dreamers looked to it as proof that different species could build a shared future. More than 40 joint settlements existed across the planet, with a combined population exceeding 100,000. The children born and raised in these communities were creating a new culture that belonged fully to neither humans nor Kalari, but to both. Jake was 53 now, and the years of constant travel and stress had left their marks. His hair had gone gray at the temples and the lines around his eyes had deepened. But he still worked his ranch when he could, and he still sat on the councils that guided integration policy, and he still believed with everything in him that the work was worth doing. The title Friend of All Tribes had brought responsibilities he'd never imagined, and sometimes the weight of it felt crushing. Kira had aged too, though Kalari showed it differently. Her patterns had taken on deeper hues that indicated maturity and wisdom among her people, and her movements had the measured grace of someone who'd learned patience through hard experience. She and Jake had become so close that people often assumed they were partners in the romantic sense, though the reality was more complicated and deeper than such simple labels. They were something that neither language had words for, and two people from different worlds who'd built a life together in the spaces between their cultures. Bridges End had grown into a small city of 5,000 residents, and it had become the cultural and administrative heart of the integration movement. The original settlement had expanded outward in rings, and each ring represented a new phase of growth and development. The architecture had evolved into a distinctive style that architects from other worlds came to study and photograph. Buildings curved and flowed in ways that honored Kalari aesthetic while incorporating human needs for enclosed spaces and right angles. The school that had started with 20 children now had over 800 students from both species. It had become a model for bicultural education, and teachers came from across the sector to train in its methods. The children who'd been in the first classes were young adults now, and many of them had chosen to stay in Bridges End or other joint settlements. They were the proof that integration could create something new and valuable, and they moved between human and Kalari society with an ease that earlier generations envied. A young woman named Maya, who'd been one of the first students, was now teaching at the school herself. She was human but spoke Kalari like a native, and her best friend and teaching partner was a Kalari named Shen. They were developing curriculum that drew from both educational traditions and creating lesson plans that other joint settlements adopted. Jake visited their classroom one afternoon and watched them teach a history lesson that covered the same events from both human and Kalari perspectives. Maya told the students about Earth's environmental collapse and the desperate search for new worlds, while Shen described the Kalari's ancient relationship with New Helena and their initial fear when humans arrived. The children asked questions that showed they understood both viewpoints, and one young Kalari boy asked why the adults hadn't just talked to each other from the beginning instead of being afraid. Maya smiled sadly and told him that fear was easier than communication, and that's why the next generation had to do better. The economic transformation of New Helena had been equally dramatic, and the planet's GDP had increased by 40% since integration began. Joint ventures and mixed ownership businesses had created wealth that benefited both communities. The colonial government and tribal councils had developed new legal frameworks that recognized dual citizenship and cross-cultural property rights. It was messy and complicated, but it worked, and it was constantly evolving as new situations arose. Jake had stepped back from his official advisory role the previous year and passed the responsibility to younger coordinators who'd grown up with integration as their normal, but he still consulted on difficult cases, and people still sought his advice when conflicts arose. A delegation from the Twilight Tribe came to his ranch one evening, seeking help with a dispute over sacred sites that a human corporation wanted to develop. Jake listened to their concerns and then facilitated a meeting between the tribe and the corporation that resulted in a compromise protecting the sites while allowing limited development nearby. The human CEO was frustrated by the restrictions, but Jake reminded him that short-term profits weren't worth destroying the relationship between their peoples. The CEO grudgingly agreed, and later admitted that the compromise had actually improved his company's reputation and led to better relationships with other tribes. It was typical of the kind of problem-solving that had become routine in finding solutions that honored both sides, rather than declaring winners and losers. Not everyone had embraced the changes, and there were still human settlements that maintained distance from the Kalari, and tribes that wanted nothing to do with integration. Governor Walsh, who was now in her third term, said that was fine, and that diversity of approaches was healthy. The key was respecting each community's choice rather than forcing a single model on everyone. Some of the traditional human settlements were struggling economically, while others thrived, and the same was true for Kalari tribes. There wasn't a single path to success. The Heritage Coalition that had opposed integration in the early years had mostly dissolved, though a few members maintained their criticism. Jake ran into their former leader Richard at a colonial assembly, and the man actually apologized for his earlier opposition. "I was wrong, Morrison, and I let fear guide me instead of hope. My daughter lives in one of the joint settlements now, and she's happier than I ever was. Sometimes it takes seeing the next generation succeed to understand your own failures." Jake told him there were no failures and only people doing their best with the information they had. Richard's skepticism in the early years had actually helped by forcing Jake and others to address legitimate concerns rather than dismissing them. Opposition had made the integration movement stronger by requiring it to prove its value rather than relying on idealism alone. Richard seemed surprised by that perspective but grateful for the grace. Kira's brother, Valen, had become the most influential Kalari leader on the planet, and he served as chief coordinator for the tribal councils working with the colonial government. He'd married a Kalari woman from the Riverkeeper tribe, and they had 3 children who were growing up in a world transformed by their uncle's and father's work. Valen visited Jake's ranch regularly, and they'd sit and talk about the old days when this had all seemed impossible. You remember when I first came to retrieve my sister and you tried to refuse payment?" Valen asked one evening while they watched the sunset. "I was so frustrated because you didn't understand that accepting our gratitude was how you showed respect." Jake laughed and admitted he'd been completely out of his depth and just trying to do what felt right. Valen's patterns pulsed with warmth. "That was exactly what made it work, and you had no agenda and no expectations. You just helped because help was needed." They talked about the challenges still ahead, and there were many. Climate change was affecting New Helena and requiring cooperation on environmental management. New waves of human immigration were straining resources and creating tensions. Some joint settlements were succeeding wildly while others struggled. The work of integration was never finished, and it required constant attention and adjustment. But Valen believed the foundation was solid enough now to withstand the challenges. Jake's health had been declining, and he'd been having chest pains that he tried to hide from Kira, but she noticed everything. She insisted he see a doctor, and the diagnosis was heart disease that would require treatment. The Kalari healers offered to try their therapies, and the human doctors wanted to use their technology, and eventually they combined approaches in a treatment plan that drew from both traditions. It worked, and Jake's condition stabilized, but he was forced to accept that he was mortal, and his time was limited. That realization led to conversations about legacy and what would happen when he was gone. Kira assured him that the movement was bigger than any one person, and that the foundations they'd built would last. But Jake worried about the settlements that had been started more recently, and whether they had the support they needed to succeed. He began writing a manual of sorts and drawing on 10 years of experience to create a guide for future coordinators. Kira helped him, and together they documented everything they'd learned about making integration work. The manual became required reading for anyone involved in establishing or managing joint settlements, and it was eventually published and distributed across the sector. Universities used it as a textbook, and diplomats cited it in negotiations with other species. Jake was embarrassed by the attention, but Kira told him he should be proud of helping others avoid the mistakes they'd made. Knowledge was meant to be shared, not hoarded. On a cool evening near the anniversary of finding Kira, Jake organized a gathering at his ranch. He invited the original 20 families from Bridges End and the core team